devote a program that focuses on right-wing anti-Semitism at another time. There'll be time for questions at the end of the presentations. Please post your questions and/or brief comments in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Your questions will be moderated by Steve Shalom from Jewish Voice for Peace. We regret that one of our speakers, Jamal Dakwar from the ACLU, was unable to join us. We greatly appreciate that David Mandel has agreed to lengthen his talk to present some of the ideas that Jamal was going to speak about. David Mandel is a human rights attorney who spent a decade living in Palestine, Israel, and finished law school in Jerusalem in 1984. Now based in Sacramento, he is active with the National Lawyers Guild, Palestine Subcommittee, as well as Jewish Voice for Peace and Democratic Socialists of America. He is an active member of the progressive wing of the California Democratic Party, where he is an elected member of the state and county central committees. This spring, he co-authored the National Lawyers Guild legal memo to the Biden-Harris administration entitled, "Bring US Policy in Line with International Law, the legal basis for immediate reversal of Trump policies on Israel-Palestine." David, it's your turn.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for inviting me. Hello, everybody. I'm going to help me maintain my train of thought better, I'm going to share my screen here and show some slides during most of the time that I will be talking. Is that working? You can see it, thumbs up? Yeah? Okay, so what I'm
mostly use it to annoy my husband and...
Oh, somebody needs to be muted there. So the purpose here is to focus particularly on the weaponization of anti-Semitism, or more accurately, the weaponization of false charges of anti-Semitism to stifle criticism of Israel and advocacy for Palestinian rights. But to get there, I'm going to talk a little bit about just what anti-Semitism is and isn't, and how this whole concept of weaponizing it to stifle discussion has been used and developed historically over the last couple of decades. So this simple definition is my own. I think I generally believe in simplicity when possible, and this is the idea here is anti-Semitism is hatred of or discrimination against Jews based on religion, perceived race, or any other categorization that somebody invents. And I'm adding just an important little explanation with the understanding that anti-Semitism is one of many forms of racism, broadly defined, that afflict modern society, each having its own characteristics. And the importance of that is that, I think probably most people here agree, and we'll get to it, that to fight anti-Semitism is best done not by isolating it and pretending that it's something totally unique, but that understanding that it is one of many forms of racism, and that to fight it is best done by solidarity with other people in fighting all racism. The axiom that never again means never again for everybody, and we need to unite and have solidarity with others. And why? Okay, there we go. So just a few key concepts. Semite is not a race, and there really is no such thing as race biologically, as we all know. There is certainly such a thing as racism. The term anti-Semitism was coined in 19th century Europe when it all of a sudden hatred of Jews was not, which had been pretty much endemic to most of European civilization for many hundreds of years, was being undermined by the fact of emancipation, in which Jews were for the first time really being treated as equal citizens, starting with the French Revolution and then in other countries as well. So somebody, I'm blanking out on his name, I don't remember, and a German guy from the 1860s, I believe, or 1880s, invented the term anti-Semitism as a nicer way of talking about hatred of Jews, right? The term Semitic really designates a linguistic family of languages, no more, no less. And therefore, just to cover a couple of things, it's really not accurate. And this you hear, I think, very well-intentioned people say, well, I can't be a anti-Semitic because I'm also a Semite, meaning somebody mostly from the Arab world, which Arabic is also a Semitic language, of course. There are others as well. And some people say that as being well-intentioned, but it's really not okay. And I try to nicely explain that that's not an accurate characterization of what anti-Semitism means. And it's also not accurate to hyphenate the word anti-Semitism, which would imply that there is such a thing as Semitism, which there is not. What are some of these particular characteristics of anti-Semitism as opposed to other forms of racism? One, its origin. I think it really started with the theological difficulty that Christians had during early Christianity, and particularly in the Middle Ages, and coping with the fact that Jews still existed, that they hadn't come around and become Christians, and they were living among Christians in Europe in particular. This evolved during feudalism into the kind of caste divisions and caste restrictions that existed in Europe, where Jews did not really fit into any of the major categories and were kind of a people apart, and then became scapegoated amid the class struggle as capitalism took hold. The fact that Jews were not allowed to own land, for instance, forced them into certain professions that made them very easily scapegoated when they began to dominate some of the fields of early capitalism, banking, money lending, for instance, which some Jews did because they had little other choice, or some of the crafts the Jews went into. The racial dimension arose with the rise of colonialism and white supremacism, which was directed mostly, of course, at colonial peoples elsewhere, but Jews were often categorized in Europe as being non-white and therefore inferior in European society. And this led to some stereotypes that persist even today, such as Jews being good with money or clever. And this is often said out of ignorance, even meant as being complimentary, but it's a stereotype that can be very damaging, as a sinister side when Jews are sometimes attributed to have hidden powers or conspiring at world domination. And I think we all know where that has led at times. So more pertinent to today's discussion is there's this concept of so-called new anti-Semitism, which I remember having been a college student as recently as the late 60s and in the 70s, when all of a sudden there was a lot of criticism that began to develop of the Israeli occupation after the 1967 war. And there was defensiveness among the people who saw themselves as having to stand up for Israel and defend Israel, where this idea of the new anti-Semitism was that, well, you're just applying old anti-Jewish ideas to the Jewish state and just transferring some of these prejudices and stereotypes to Israel as the Jewish state, and it's really no different. And I certainly noticed it even way back then and tried to oppose it, as many of us did. But recently, in the last few years, it's been taken to new heights where even mild responses, very recently, to international law violations and the illegality of settlements in the occupied territories, which is a pretty much universally accepted concept, except among the Israeli government and its supporters. So when the European Union has insisted, in theory more than in practice, of labeling settlement products as being distinct from things that are made in Israel, or the most recent Ben and Jerry's move of not selling in the settlements in the occupied territories, you see this extreme reaction that these things are being described as horrific anti-Semitism, even though I think most of us would agree that they're anything but it's a I think a hysterical reaction to this to the criticism of trying to defend the indefensible, and a fallback position more and more has become, well, if we call it anti-Semitism, that helps us fight it, even if we can't really argue with the essence of the policies that it's being criticized. Oh, good, I can move my little thing over so I can see what I'm looking at. So that gets to what's known commonly today and has been a lot in the news the last few years is the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. It's the International Holocaust Remembrance Association. But to go back before it became called that, this was just the history, and then we'll look at the definition itself. It was developed first in 2004, very much behind closed doors after experts with this a European Monitoring Center on Racism and Xenophobia, which is connected with the European Union, perceived a need for better tools to distinguish between anti-Semitism and the increasing political criticism of Israel. This was during a lot of the escalating violence that happened after the second Intifada. If you remember back to that period, and the falling apart of the whole Oslo process. So there was a lot of contention and a lot of criticism of what Israel was doing. And people were saying this is anti-Semitism, as we already mentioned. So it was this very closed door definition, behind closed doors definition that was developed, was highly influenced by people from the American Jewish Committee, which is has become a quite conservative part of the Israel lobby, including who was the main author of the definition back then, Kenneth Stern, who has since denounced its use as a speech code or having any legal force. And this has been very, I think, important in trying to take the air out of the balloon of this definition. But it was, a lot of people quickly latched onto this and touted it as the definitive gold standard definition of anti-Semitism. And it was very much used to label uncomfortable criticism as anti-Semitic. Anyway, this agency, European Union Monitoring Center on Racism and Xenophobia, changed its name. It's now, I'm blanking out on what it's called. It's something else, but it dropped this definition from its website in 2010 because it realized that it was being misused in the ways that I just described. But it was in that same year, it was posted by the US State Department and became known as the State Department definition of anti-Semitism, which was very much used and abused in the same way. But somewhat orphaned, people felt that it needed a new home, a new parent, as it were. So in 2016, it was adopted by the IHRA, we call it IRA, which is previously a fairly obscure and low-key research and educational institution, which is focused on, not surprisingly, the Holocaust. It's still officially called a working definition. It specifies that it's not legally binding, and sometimes it's accompanied by a sentence at the end that says, criticism of Israel, not unlike criticism of any other country, is not necessarily anti-Semitic. And I'm paraphrasing because when I looked today, I saw that sentence is not there on the official IRA site or on the State Department site, which I'm pretty sure it had been in the past. So I'm kind of curious, and I'll need to find out why they dropped it or if they did. And it's interesting because it kind of gave them cover for saying, oh no, not all criticism is anti-Semitic, which you often hear. But in fact, this is being strongly pushed for formal adoption by dozens. It's been adopted by dozens of countries, posted by the State Department under the IRA name. It was mandated in the executive order that Trump issued at a Hanukkah party in 2019, and by Kenneth Marcus, who was then the head of the Office of Civil Rights in the U.S. Department of Education, who's been a big leader in effort to get this adopted and to use it to stifle particularly Palestinian advocacy on campuses. And I think we'll hear from a couple of people later about how that has worked out in practice. There were failed attempts to adopt it officially in what was called in Congress, in the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which never made it through Congress. It was introduced several times in the past 5 or 6 years. But there was a little success at the state level. Adopting the definition was introduced in 9 states, including New Jersey, I would note, and it was passed in 3 states, not including New Jersey. So within like a year or so, a lot of us expected a wave of state legislation to adopt this definition, but it doesn't seem to have materialized, unlike the anti-boycott wave that was passed in most states in one form or another 4, 5, 6 years ago. So more resistance to the use of the definition has developed, including from civil libertarians and even liberal Zionists who realize how destructive it is to even the maybe limited criticism that some of them have of Israel. So the definition itself is this thing here, which I'll just read quickly. Anti-Semitism, and with annotated, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews. Well, what does that mean? A certain perception, which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews, which begs the question, well, how else may it be expressed? Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals. Well, that could be anybody, and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. In other words, I find this to be a very convoluted and kind of vague and meaningless definition. But the real problem are some of the examples that it was subsequently, the problem that's gotten most of the attention. It's been said that 7 of the 11 examples have to do with Israel. Not all of them are all that terrible. For instance, these 3 I would pretty much agree with, using symbols and images associated with classic anti-Semitism to characterize Israel or Israelis. Yeah, if you use classic anti-Semitism to characterize Israel or Israelis without actually focusing on real political criticism, that is anti-Semitic, I would agree. Or accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal to Israel or to the alleged priorities of Jews worldwide and to the interests of their own nations. Yeah, that's problematic, and you do hear it sometimes. On the other hand, it's kind of not surprising to hear that when you have the Israel and its supporters basically claiming that Israel speaks for all Jews worldwide. So if that's true, then it's not surprising that some people think, well, if that's the case, then maybe Jews are more loyal to Israel. So that's this points to a problem, but it's a problem that I think is being amplified by the defenders of Israeli policies. And similarly, holding Jews collectively responsible for the actions of the state of Israel. Same comment. Some of the more problematic examples included in the definition are denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, for instance, claiming that the existence of the state of Israel is a racist endeavor. Well, that totally negates, I would say, the experience of just about all Palestinians for whom the state of Israel has been a racist endeavor since they have become on the losing end of a whole lot of racist policies. So does that make them anti-Semites if they explain that or say what it's been like for them? I think that's extremely problematic. And also denying the Jewish people the right to self-determination. Well, arguably Israeli Jews maybe have a right to self-determination, and I'll get back to that, but Jewish people as a whole living in New Jersey or California, as I do, right to self-determination means up to and including the right to have our own independent state. If we have no intention or plans to live in Israel or to create a Jewish state in California or in New Jersey, then it's really not relevant to Jewish people living in the rest of the world. Another example, applying double standards by requiring of it, meaning Israel, a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. that's problematic. I mean, can I not criticize a country unless I criticize all countries? And there are, of course, plenty of countries in the world that violate human rights and international law. That's a very problematic example. Or drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. And I just want to just go to several important distinctions that are often conflated in this connection. The first one is connected with that last example that they give, which is, accusing Israel of Nazi-like behavior may be not a very productive strategy. It may be offensive. It may not be a particularly useful way of criticism, but it is not at all the same of using Nazi images to attack Jews or even to attack Israel. Those are two very different things, and I think that's an important distinction. Criticism of Israel as a result of anti-Semitism, something that some white supremacists do, those who haven't yet gotten the message that, well, maybe Israel's a good place because it's a great example of an ethno-state like what they want to create for white people in America, but it's kind of a different story. So criticism of Israel as a result of anti-Semitism is very different from some anti-Semitic, or what may be seen as anti-Semitic expressions that I do hear sometimes from Palestinians or other people, which I think come more out of ignorance and out of this conflation that happens with defenders of Israel, saying that, well, Jewishness and Zionism are one and the same, or all Jews. Israel represents all Jews. Well, if people hear that again and again, then sometimes they're going to maybe come out with what sound like anti-Semitic expressions. And I think, it's worth calling people on it or explaining that, but that's very different from some of the core anti-Semitic attitudes that I mentioned earlier. Well, time is passing quickly. I'll try to hurry up here. Denying the right of self-determination for a national group. Israeli Jews, there's some debate as to whether Israeli Jews constitute a national group with the right of self-determination. I personally think they do. They've become that, whether we like the origin of it or not, versus advocating for radical change in the form of that self-determination. So self-determination does not necessarily mean an independent state, and it certainly does not mean a racist, exclusive state in which one people is superior to other people who live there. So you can criticize that without necessarily denying the right of self-determination. I think that's an important distinction. And often you'll hear, well, there's anti-Semitism on both sides. There's the white supremacist or evangelical Christian-based anti-Semitism versus, which is really comes from one of the classic sources, religious or racist, versus left-wing and so-called left-wing anti-Semitism, which I think when something sounds, I think that some of the stereotypes and misunderstandings of who Jews are and what anti-Semitism exist throughout society, including among left-wingers, but it's much more often out of ignorance or misunderstanding and some of the other ways that I've already described. So I think it's important to distinguish that that the big manifestations of anti-Semitism we see in this country, particularly the violent ones, are coming from the far-right white supremacist point of view, in which anti-Semitism is really a core tenet, and it is expressed in a way that we've heard several times. The person who shot up the synagogue in Pittsburgh said he was attacking Jews because they were behind all the effort to replace white people with brown and black people by encouraging the immigration and so on, even though he didn't recognize Jews as being non-white. Somehow there's this great conspiracy. That's a classic anti-Semitic attitude that I do not think you find, except maybe sometimes to a certain extent, out of ignorance and left-wing anti-Semitism. So an important counter to the IHRA definition is this thing called the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, which was released earlier this year. Some of you may have heard of it. If not, you can look it up. I recommend you read it. It was released, like I said, earlier this year. A couple hundred people signed it, virtually all of them Jewish academics. They worked on it for a couple of years before they did. in their ideological range was from self-described liberal Zionists to self-described anti-Zionists, which I think is a very good thing in countering something as pernicious as the IRA definition. And it was deliberately couched as a counter to the IRA and written with a similar pattern, but much more clear. For instance, it starts with a very simple, straightforward definition. Anti-Semitism is discrimination, prejudice, hostility, or violence against Jews as Jews or Jewish institutions as Jewish. A little bit more complicated than the one that I wrote that I gave at the beginning, but still pretty simple, straightforward, and clear. And then it gives examples as the IRA one does, but instead of the IRA saying, well, these are things that could be anti-Semitic without really saying when they are and when they aren't, and some very problematic ones, as I mentioned. The Jerusalem definition gives examples of what are on the face of it anti-Semitic or what are on the face of it not anti-Semitic. I don't have time to go into those examples. I think most of them are very, very good. I suggest you read it if you haven't. You can easily find it online. There have been some criticisms of it from Palestine solidarity groups. For one thing, the name, why call it the Jerusalem Declaration? Well, there's some explanations for that. Most of the beginning of the deliberations took place actually in Jerusalem. Some people said, well, Jerusalem, we were in favor of Jerusalem being a symbol of a city, a holy city for everybody. It doesn't mean that we recognize it as the sole capital of Israel. It's kind of I think a petty criticism. Why were no Palestinians involved? I think the answer to that is obvious, because this was meant as a response to IHRA. It's meant as a Jewish statement, and there are plenty of, there was a Palestinian statement that came out against IRA last year sometime, I believe, which was also very, very good. Nobody asked why were no Jews involved in that, because it was a Palestinian state, and that's fine, I think. And then again, why focus on Israel as a main link to anti-Semitism? Well, again, the reason was because this was a response to the IRA definition. There's been some specific criticism of example number 10, which says denying the right of Jews in the state of Israel to exist and flourish collectively and individually as Jews in accordance with the principle of equality. Some people, I think, read that as supporting the existence of a Jewish state. I disagree. I think this is an example of something that is not anti-Semitism, right? Or excuse me, that is anti-Semitism, because I think it does challenge the right of Jews as Jews, and I think maybe it could have been written. Maybe I would have written it a little bit differently, but I just wanted to present that as an example. One of the things that has been criticized, but I think if you look at it carefully, it's not. I don't think it's majorly problematic. Finally, I recommend on this whole subject as a resource is a group called Independent Jewish Voices, which is very similar ideologically to Jewish Voice for Peace in Canada, which put out 2 years ago a comprehensive report on anti-Semitism and IHRA. There's the link for it. I can copy that into the chat as well. And as we go on, and it's about 30 pages long, and it gives a very comprehensive criticism of IHRA. This was the IRA definitions. This was before the Jerusalem Declaration came out, of course, but it has its own. Sorry, that's my last slide in this part of it. It includes its own definition, which is like a whole page long, so I'm not going to post it or read it, which I think is a much more detailed definition. I think it's fine, but usually shorter definitions are better. So I recommend that people who want to learn more about the subject take a look at this, and that's it for the moment. And we'll be happy to hear what the others have to say about their personal experiences, and then discuss any questions or further comments afterwards. Thank you. Stop screen sharing.
So one of the reasons we wanted to have this webinar is because we really wanted to make a distinction, which David has done in his talk, that there is a real difference between criticism of Zionism and being anti-Semitic. And we thought that it would be helpful to have people speak and talk about their own stories to get a sense of what the IRA definition has done to people and what this whole idea of if you criticize Israel, you're anti-Semitic, and how that has affected people and organizations in their existence and in their lives. And so we invited Sonny Lloyd to talk about his experience in the Los Angeles Teachers Union. And we have also invited a young man. We have also invited Ryan from Yale to talk about his experiences. We could be criticized for not actually having Palestinians speak who have suffered, who have been called anti-Semitic for their criticism of Zionism and their criticisms of Israel. Unfortunately, probably because it's summer, Marshall Love and I, who organized this webinar together, we tried very, very hard to find some Palestinians to represent that point of view, and we're not able to. It's also interesting, and I know David said this to me when I spoke to him yesterday. He said, hey, an all-male panel in these days. And I also want to say that we tried very hard to get some women to speak on this subject, and we're not able to. So that being said, I'd like to introduce Sonny, who teaches US history, government, and economics at Venice High School in Los Angeles. He was the union chapter chair of Venice High School for the past 2 years and the assistant chair for 5 years. He has served on many union organizing committees and is the sponsor of the Black Student Union at Venice High. He is a longtime anti-imperialist activist and part of the Save Venice Coalition, the group fighting gentrification and social injustice in West Los Angeles. Sonny?
Thank you. Glad to be here. For no other reason that talk by Mr. Mandel was very educational. I really needed to hear that. I definitely have been accused of anti-Semitism very publicly. If you Google my name, the second article that comes up now is California teacher activist has a history of anti-Semitic posts. And they do this hit piece on me pretty much, taking two posts from my Facebook feed, ignoring all the other stuff I've posted over the years on anti-war and anti-racism. Taking 2 posts that I posted during the recent bombing. And one post showed Netanyahu dropping bombs on Gaza and a bloody hand coming out of Gaza asking for help. And in the other post was a repost of a Rashida Tlaib speech before Congress. And, I basically, in the introduction to the post, I compared white supremacy and Zionism as like 2 basically horrific systems. So they took those posts and they used those as centerpieces to accuse me of anti-Semitism. And, they really tried to go after, I see they really tried to go after people's reputation. They try to go after your career. There's multiple, I've been called in by my employer, LAUSD, and there's people, other teachers actually in LA, and an organization, the Jewish Federation of Los Angeles, wrote a letter to my principal as well, actually all the way up to the school board. And they're saying, you have a teacher that's anti-Semite and you need to do something about him, basically. To me, it's calling for my job, but, I'm definitely not going to back down to any bullying like that, but it has ended people's careers. So it is, this is all I have is my job to support myself and my family, but it comes with the territory. So, how this originated with, on the union side of things, on March 19th, our union, we have our area meetings where we meet in 8 different areas of Los Angeles. Los Angeles is so big that we can't all meet at once. You know, we break up into east, west, north, northeast, south, harbor, central. And so at the area meetings, you know, what that happen once a month, any member can bring a motion to, you know, try to make that into union policy. And on this particular area meeting, it was in the midst of the bombing. A lot of members got organized, and we wrote motions and decided we were going to bring them all across the city to create kind of this upswell of support for Palestine with our voice as a union. We're 33,000 teachers. We're the second largest teachers union in the United States. And so we figured we can make a statement, you know, that can go a long way in public sentiment. So, you know, we brought them, I was one of the people who brought the motion in West Los Angeles, and basically it called for the end of US aid to Israel, an end to the bombing, and to support the BDS movement, to have our union, you know, sign on to that as a statement, and as, you know, this is what we want the policy of the US government to be. So the motion passed in 5 different areas of Los Angeles. And the pressure kind of started on me the next day. I brought it back to my chapter. I'm the chapter chair at Venice High School. It's a big high school in Los Angeles. And I wanted to bring this motion to a local level. We have 100 teachers. We meet every week. There's about 30 or 40 teachers that come to the meetings. And I went over the motion with my chapter and said, this is what happened last night. You know, how do we as a high school, you know, in this moment, how do we want to respond? What do we think about this motion that our brothers and sisters are bringing? And there was sentiment at the high school to actually learn more about Israel-Palestine. And from there, we decided to have a teach-in on Israel-Palestine, to use our resources. I'm a history teacher. We have other history teachers. And a lot of people said, you know, they know about it. And so we decided we were going to pool resources and study the issue. And so we could all be informed voters, because the way what happened with the motion, it would move up to the House of Reps. And so the formal body, the larger body that represents everyone, would vote on it and make it into policy. So we decided, let's learn about this. From there, somebody at the meeting must have leaked the ongoings of our union meeting to the public, because from there, I got some nasty emails the very next day accusing me of bringing a pro-Palestinian bias to the high school, planning a pro-Palestinian event, and, you know, questioning my credentials as a teacher to be doing this, and I'm making things unsafe for the Jewish students at my high school. So I kind of ignored the letters because they were they weren't trying to dialogue with me. They were just name calling, basically accusing me of things. But the next week I was called in by my school administration, and the letters, there was 5 letters shared with me, basically all accusing me of anti-Semitism and inflaming, you know, anti-Semitism at my high school, which would make Jewish people, you know, they connected it also to, I guess there was an attack on at a Jewish restaurant or something in Los Angeles, like during the attacks on Gaza. There was, you know, the way it was reported in the news that I guess some Palestinians in Los Angeles attacked 2 Jewish people at an eatery in Los Angeles. And they use that in the letters to say, this is the type of environment I'm creating, making things unsafe for Jewish people. So, you know, the administration, they basically just said this is an informal meeting. You know, they weren't taking any action toward my job. And, you know, they were just putting us on record. They're meeting with me about this. And I just responded, you know, that I don't have any anti-Jewish sentiment whatsoever. And a lot of people can attest to that. And so from there, I mean, it shook me up a little bit, but the very next week, there were, the LA Times reached out to me for a statement on the motions, because I'm kind of known as an outspoken person in my union. So I gave the LA Times a statement, which is basically saying, you know, unions are inherently anti-imperialist and anti-racist. You know, to be pro-labor is to fight for human rights, you know, and it's indivisible. That's everywhere. It's not just for one group of people. And so if we see a group of people around the world in under oppression, we are going to speak up, right? And so the quote went nicely into the LA Times, but the very same day, these hit pieces came out on me. California teacher is an anti-Semite. If you Google my name, you can see, unfortunately, you can see the articles. So I've written my own blog. I'll share it with you in the chat, mxloyd.com, just to kind of counter, you know, I want to get my statement out there in my own words, my beliefs. And so, you know, they can't completely just control the narrative about what I believe. But that, you know, it doesn't really carry the weight. There's a whole network, right? My friends in like SEO, search optimization, that whole field where you get the high rankings in Google, and how you do it, you know, your article, you get a lot of other news agencies to repost your article or link your article. And that's what they've done to me. He showed me like all the networks of news agencies that the Daily Wire and the Free Beacon Press are tied into. And so that keeps my name popping up very high in Google. So to counter that, I would have to get my blog, I would have to get my, you know, the Times, and I would have to get a lot of other news agencies to link my blog to kind of counter that in Google. So that's kind of, you know, the PR side of it. It's, you know, you know, talking about David and Goliath, you know, when you come up against this, you're just a teacher, and you're going up against the right-wing media apparatus that's smearing your name. But I'm still not too worried. Maybe I should be more worried, but I'm not. You know, I stand on principle. I stand for the truth. So after I kind of spent the summer writing this blog. I probably spent too long working on it, but I did want to put my voice out there. And what's happened with the motion in UTLA, there's been so much pressure, because even UTLA has been smeared in the media, not just me and individual teachers, but if you look at UTLA, they're saying UTLA is a culture of racism and anti-Semitism. You know, that's what you'll find a lot of those articles, and they're basically referring to this motion. You know, they're saying, how dare UTLA stand up for Palestinian rights? You know, we're an anti-Semitic union now. And so our leadership has cowered down, unfortunately, and they just met in secret session last week, and they decided to kill the Palestinian motions and substitute them for a series of educational forums on Israel-Palestine that, you know, our union will, you know, support. So I'll be interested to see what type of forums these will be. You know, we had no problem signing on with Black Lives Matter and supporting that right away. In the whole, you know, the George Floyd uprisings, we were right in step with all of that as a union. But when it comes to Palestine, we're backing down. And actually, the union put out a statement saying they're neutral. They're not taking a position as the board of the union. So they're kind of going against the membership, which is, there was, you know, these 5 areas passed super majorities, right? These pro-Palestinian motions. But the leadership is saying, well, we're neutral. We're not taking a stance. We want to study the issue, which I feel is in history, you know, we're not going to look so good. You know, it's what we supported South Africa, right? We supported ending apartheid, right? We didn't need to study that. We saw the right and wrong of that. We took a stance. I was way before I was a teacher, but I know that was a stance that labor took, was to, you know, end and boycott apartheid in South Africa. So yeah, that's pretty much my experience, you know, and there's other teachers in LA that kind of we're kind of going through it together. So we pulled together LA Jews for Peace has been really good, writing letters on my support. The Jewish Voice for Peace has been very good. And then local, actually, I've been teaching at the school for 15 years, so I know a lot of the community, and there's a lot of, it's actually, there's a lot of Jewish people in the community here in West Los Angeles. And so I've taught a lot of the students, I know a lot of the parents, and they heard what was going on, and they jumped in and wrote letters on my behalf as well, because they know that's not what I'm about at all. And yeah, that's, I could go on, but I'm sure in Q&A, you guys might have some questions for me, but that's my experience, and thanks a lot for inviting me.
Thanks, Sony. One thing I would like to pick up on really quickly that Sony said in his presentation was the whole idea that Jewish students will not feel safe if Palestine is discussed in school in any way that's supportive. And it's really interesting that something like that is happening right now in New Jersey. The Rutgers adjunct teachers union just passed, or is in the process of passing, a motion in support of Palestinian rights. And they too were accused of creating an atmosphere on campus that would not be safe for Jewish students. And that is something that has happened all over the country. So now, our next speaker is Ryan Gittler Muniz. He's an organizer with Yale Jews for Palestine and graduated from Yale College in 2016, where they were co-president of Migration Alliance at Yale. They are a freelance writer, community organizer, and border abolitionist for Ocean County, New Jersey. One of the things you will notice that Ryan helped organize Jews for Palestine. You don't have to be Palestinian or Muslim or Black to be labeled anti-Semitic. Ryan?
Thank you so much, Alice. And thank you everyone for having me. Thank you, Sony, for your talk. I felt a lot of resonances with your experience with kind of what I have gone through. So like Alice said, my name is Ryan Gittler Muniz. I'm a 2020 Yale graduate from Brick Township in Ocean County. So it's nice to be in the company of a lot of New Jersey folks. But I recently organized a group of Jews at Yale called Yale Jews for Palestine. And given our organizing work, we've been kind of slandered as anti-Semitic as well. But I guess I can start at the very beginning of my trajectory as an anti-Zionist Jewish organizer, which was when I was an undergrad at Yale, and I joined Yale Students for Justice in Palestine as a sophomore. And at that time, our chapter was incredibly small, had only recently been brought back from the dead, basically. It was basically flitting in and out of existence. When I was a sophomore, someone had brought it back, and it was a group of some Jews, some Palestinians, some non-Palestinian Arab students, just like a mixed bag of folks who wanted to start a dialogue on campus around Israel-Palestine, but didn't know where to start. I'm not sure how familiar any of you are with Yale, but relative to most American universities, I would say it's probably one of, if not the most Zionist, or at least just comfortable with Israel's policies. You'd think among maybe the Ivy League, those schools would be kind of uniform, but our peer institution, Columbia, for example, last year, the entire student body voted to endorse BDS. They had a student majority vote on that, and their student government passed the initiative. And so other schools have moved a lot further than Yale's, and only until very recently has any kind of dialogue begun. So when I was an underclassman, was organizing with SJP, and basically our club was constantly in fear. The only two very prominent organizers we had, who were the presidents of the club, were put on Canary Mission very quickly, which is a website that tracks usually like college age Palestinian rights organizers. They had made a GoFundMe to try and go to the SJP National Conference in LA, and through doing that, got put on Canary Mission. We also had a protest on campus around Israeli bombings in Gaza, and one of our Palestinian student members was called a terrorist by a passerby, just someone yelled that at her. And just in general, whenever the club wanted to do an action, oh, sorry, Virginia, I'm speaking too quickly. basically we were definitely fearful of any kind of action, especially the Palestinian students on campus who felt like their voices were constantly silenced, and the majority on campus preferred it that way. Our student center on campus, the Slivka Center, has a large Israeli flag out front, and I knew when I arrived at Yale that that meant it wouldn't be home for me, and for Palestinian students and just people who are proponents for Palestinian rights know that that place is not one where they feel safe or comfortable. So organizing at Yale has been really hard for a very long time. But recently in May, with the recent assaults on Sheikh Jarrah and Al-Aqsa, a group of Palestinian, mostly Palestinian students released a statement very quickly condemning Israel's actions and called upon Yale student groups to sign on and kind of grow this newer movement called Yaleys for Palestine. Since I'm no longer a Yale student, I was only kind of hearing about this through the grapevine. And when I saw the statement posted, I noticed that it was quite moderate in a way. It was very careful and very succinct around Israel's actions and condemning them. It did use the word genocide to describe those actions, and it drew a link between American racism and white supremacy and the plight of the Palestinians. But there were no demands made upon the Yale student body, upon the Slivka Center, upon the university to disclose or divest any of its holdings in Israeli companies. And I wanted to know why. So I reached out to some of my friends who were behind the statement, and one of them told me that they were just afraid. They were afraid to make those claims because they knew that it would open them up to a lot of hate and a lot of slander, and mainly slander as anti-Semites. And so I realized that as a Jew and as someone who's sort of been in the know with other anti-Zionist Jews, I knew that there was an opportunity for us to make space for Palestinian students and maybe publish a statement of our own. And so I quickly banded together as many, progressive Jews that I knew at Yale, either current students or alumni. We joined a group chat, and over the next week had a bunch of Zoom calls, long debates, discussions, agonizing over the statement we were going to publish. What would we want to say? How would we want to say it? What would our goals be? What were we doing this for? How would we publish it? And in the end, we released a statement on May 14th. The group was about 40 people, but only around like 15 signed the statement because we did go quite hard left, I guess you could say. So we directly called upon the Slivka Student Center to remove its Israeli flag. We called upon our school to disclose and divest its investments in Israeli companies. We endorsed the BDS, and we kind of called out the just general culture of silence around Palestine, both at Yale and in America at large and in American Jewish establishments. And we also offered our own vision of a Judaism apart from Zionism, where we would be in solidarity with other oppressed groups combating racism and in solidarity with Palestinians. So it was an amazing action. It was beautiful. And initially, like I said, there were only about 15 signatures, but within a few days of publicizing it, we got over 100. And right now we have over 115 signatures from Yale affiliated Jews. I'll send a link to the letter in the chat right now so you guys can read it. And if you know anyone who's a Jewish Yale alum or current student, they should definitely sign. And we all thought that having that statement, having the organizing from the Palestinian students with their statement would cause a lot of waves, make a lot of action. But the organizations we wanted to kind of hear back from kind of ghosted us. So the Slivka Center for Jewish Life never responded to us, even though we reached out. Some of us had individual conversations with some of their leadership, but nothing more organized. Our student paper didn't write about us at all, even though this was like quite a significant initiative. And it wasn't until last month when the Palestinian student group, Yaleys for Palestine, lobbied the Yale College Council, basically the student government of Yale, to endorse their statement. And so the Yale College Council decided to hold a meeting hearing from both sides on the issue around whether or not they should endorse the original statement of condemnation. They invited Yaleys for Palestine, and they invited the Slivka Center and some like Yale Hillel and some other Jewish student groups to make up both sides. But our coalition of Yale Jews was never consulted and didn't have any space to speak. And so it wasn't until the Palestinian students reached out to us and said, have you been contacted about this? Do you know this is happening? We didn't. And so they actually gave up part of their time to allow us to speak. And so I read a statement, some other students in our coalition read a statement kind of explaining why it was so important for the Yale College Council to endorse a resolution like this, and how critique of Israel and Zionism is not anti-Semitic, and how we needed to be present to kind of combat what the other folks on the call were saying, which were all Jews, and they were all kind of talking about how the passing of a statement would make Jews on campus feel unsafe, and how they didn't feel it was right for the Yale College Council to speak out on this when they should be more neutral. And it was disappointing, but not surprising. And luckily, the endorsement actually passed 8-3 with 4 abstentions, and one of the senators who voted for the endorsement was Jewish, and he had signed our letter and talked about why it was very important to him to vote in the affirmative. So it passed. And when that happened, kind of all hell broke loose. So that was basically a month after our initial statement, but that's when national and international media kind of took notice. So the Slivka Center immediately published a statement right after the vote. They called both the statement and the endorsement of it anti-Semitic, and they picked apart some of the language to kind of explain why using the label of genocide is anti-Semitic, why these students didn't necessarily mean to give into these long tropes, but they did, and it was harmful. And we were very disgusted. And from that press release, a lot of international Jewish media picked up the vote. So Jewish Telegraphic Agency, Times of Israel, and just some other, and then also some right-wing publications as well started running with it. And so what happens next is no one cared to mention a lot of these articles, both the feelings of Palestinian students on campus and the organizing that my group had done as Yale Jews, anti-Zionist Yale Jews. And so the original JTA article didn't really mention us at all, didn't mention our letter or the signatories, but I badgered the reporter on Twitter about it, and he added a sentence mentioning us and linking our statement. And then Ted Cruz actually tweeted that article, and immediately right away, we got a huge amount of anti-Semitic hate on our letter initially. So the way the letter works is you have to fill out a Google form with your email address to sign it. And people were making throwaway email accounts to add their name. And the names were evoking Nazi and Holocaust imagery. And we got probably dozens of signatures with just grotesque names. And just, I won't even go into the specifics, but that was all of a sudden, the seemingly the right corners of the internet got a hold of what we were doing, and it really blew up. So I guess while that was happening, we were just trying to get our narrative out the door. So we released a press release. Yale Jews for Palestine and Yale Jews for Palestine released a joint statement. We publicized that through Twitter and through emailing a bunch of reporters. We got Mondoweiss to write about us and a lot of other progressive Jewish publications and just progressive publications in general. And that was really affirming. So we got our message out there as well in a really powerful way. But it's been, so that was in June. Our initial statement was in May. And so far, our own student paper, the Yale Daily News, has not written a single article about us. We have lobbied on them for weeks on weeks. I was interviewed by a reporter there. That was a month ago. I actually emailed her today to ask why the piece hadn't been published. And apparently there's problems higher up. The Jewish Student Center doesn't want the piece released. There's just some really frustrating grumblings happening behind the scenes to keep our movement hidden. And it's been really frustrating. So the latest for our movement is we finally had a meeting with the head rabbi at Slivka Center, maybe about a few weeks ago. And their statement that they released was really horrible, and we all agreed that it was quite inflammatory. And part of the hate that the Palestinian organizers received, because a lot of them received their own hate on social media, and part of the hate that we received on our letter was due to the inflammatory language in the initial statement that the Jewish Center released. So when we met with the head rabbi, we kind of said that and talked about why we felt like they had really failed us as Jews. And the response that we got was incredibly disappointing. It basically said that our group of Jews was very insular, and the word I think the head rabbi used was an echo chamber, and that if we, held these views and didn't really want to work with Slivka Center or their administration or just kind of more moderate positions on Israel, then we wouldn't really have a place there. And it was very shocking to hear that. And right now we're kind of strategizing on how to build this movement into something we can bring for the next school year. How do we challenge the Jewish Student Center to do better and to call them out, because we've realized that we as a group of anti-Zionist Yale Jews have finally a lot of space to make these demands and to push things. And our hope is always that we're making space for the Palestinian organizers to also be along with us. So our two movements are very overlapped and enmeshed, and it's been a really incredible thing to watch after organizing for Palestine as an undergraduate at Yale and seeing really no movement at all. But within the past 2-3 months, I've seen decades worth of change at Yale. So it's been very encouraging, but also just very disappointing. And we're up against kind of the same forces that we were facing before. And it's just kind of an uphill battle. But I'm optimistic, I'm hopeful, and I'm really glad that I could share my story with you all today. So thank you for having me, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, there are 3 questions in the chat. I'm sorry, in the Q&A. I'm not sure if the people who wrote the questions still want to ask them, because maybe one of the speakers answered it later on. But the first one was from Nancy Stern, and David, this was for you. She wanted to follow up on the question of why Arabs shouldn't say that they can't be anti-Semitic if in fact it refers to a linguistic category.
Well, I'll try to reiterate. This kind of gets into again, a semantic thing. Semitism is not a thing. There's a Semitic family of languages. It's not a race. In fact, I think most of us agree there is no such thing as race. So, and the origin of the word anti-Semitism was specifically directed at Jews. So therefore, it's just kind of an almost too clever by half thing to say, well, I'm Semitic, so therefore I couldn't be anti-Semitic. There is no such thing as being Semitic. You may, your native language or one that you learn may be a Semitic language. And I mention it because I do think it's important, because it counters the whole concept of there being any kind of race that defines Jews or Arabs or anybody else for that matter. And it puts, I think it's just important to put the focus back on anti-Semitism. And some people say that we should stop using the word anti-Semitism because it's so misleading, partly for that reason. Should call it Judeophobia or just anti-Jewish racism or something like that. But I just, maybe it's part of personal pet peeve, because I think it distracts from the conversation about what real anti-Semitism is and is not to say that, since it's certainly not, Semite is certainly not a race. That some people may disagree, but that's my view, and I think I've adhered to it strongly enough that I wanted to mention that.
Thank you. A second question, also for you, David, comes from Connie Hammond. If the IHRA definition was designed as a tool for distinguishing anti-Semitism from criticism of Israel, why did they include criticism of the state of Israel in the examples of anti-Semitism?
Okay, I think that's fairly simple. I'm sorry if it didn't come across well when I said. I think that was the original intention of this European Union agency. They were monitoring anti-Semitism and other forms of racism through Europe, and they kind of came up, well, what is it? What is anti-Semitic and what isn't? Because even back then there were people using the term, the new anti-Semitism that I described, to apply to criticism of Israel. So I think that was a well-intentioned initial call, and I think it got hijacked by people who wanted to create this definition to use exactly for the opposite purpose. And I think that's what we're hearing from Kenneth Stern as well. He was the main writer of that definition, and I think he took it to heart that was the purpose. And he still says, it's maybe a useful definition for monitoring or distinguishing, but it's not. It should absolutely not be used with any legal consequences or as a speech code or anything like that. So the point was it got opportunistically hijacked to be used in that way.
Thanks. Okay, so this question from Marta Berg is really for all three of you. Do false accusations of anti-Semitism conceal or reveal deep anti-Arab sentiment among Jews and Christians? Anyone want to take that?
I'll say this about that. I don't know if it reveals anything, but I do find it very ironic that these accusations are coming from people who actively support apartheid and ethnic cleansing in the land, right? Paul Singer the billionaire hedge fund manager who runs the Free Beacon Press, right? I looked him up. He gives a lot of money to the Israeli government, right? And he's basically supporting the occupation. So it's very ironic that someone who's supporting the oppression of the Palestinians is able to turn around and call somebody else a racist. You know, so it's just it's a cover, and I think a lot of these charges come from people who do harbor some serious racial or ethnic, superiority, supremacist beliefs, and it's just a way for it just gives them cover to do their dastardly deeds. So that's
if I can just add something to that briefly. Oh, sorry, Brian, do you want to go ahead?
I was just asking, are we answering Marta's question? I'm sorry, I was typing and I missed the reading.
Yes, Marta's question.
I would just say that I love that question, and I do think that the specific kind of hate that we've received over this movement has been very Islamophobic from the start. And a great example is the president of Yale YCC. She's actually the first Muslim woman to ever be president. She's a hijabi, and she got a huge amount of online hate from the YCC vote, even though, if anyone knew anything about the way the YCC works, only student senators vote on endorsing statements. So she actually had nothing to do with the endorsement. She just called the meeting to action, and the senators themselves voted, but she was the target for a lot of online hate. And I do think that we don't often talk about how Islamophobic, not only the hate that Palestinian organizers get, but just the general climate of the US is just very Islamophobic and anti-Arab. So I appreciate that question.
David,
I'll just add quickly. I agree. I would just add, there's a lot, there you can find some things that have been written about it, about the anti-Arab portrayals in the media are very common. There was a really good film a decade or more ago called Real Bad Arabs that was made by, I'm blanking out on his name. It showed how some of these negative stereotypes are used. There's a lot of anti-Arab racism and Islamophobia for sure. There's one thing I think is interesting. Just last week, Peter Beinart, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, published a piece about what he calls anti-Palestinianism, which is maybe a specific version of both Islamophobia. Most Palestinians are Muslim background, and anti-Arab, and specifically anti-Palestinian. And he said we should start calling it that and relating it to it as such. And I won't speak for him, but I'm sure if it appeared in his separate blog or in Jewish Currents, but I'm sure you can easily find it. And I thought it was very, very well done and thought-provoking, and I recommend it.
Thank you. Mira Jaffrey has a question for Ryan. You mentioned that Columbia has endorsed the BDS movement. I'm curious about which universities have endorsed BDS.
That's a great question. I wish I knew more concretely, but anecdotally, I know Columbia. I have a friend at the University of Minnesota. They've had a student. So what usually happens is the student body will vote on whether or not to endorse some kind of statement that articulates the BDS movement. And I think Columbia and Minnesota are two that come to mind. But Yale is very far from something like that happening. I know UChicago had something more recently similar to what happened at Yale. Their student government endorsed a statement condemning Israel's actions. And there was a concerted campaign to get them to rescind that statement. And there was a lot of press from the UChicago paper. People published a lot of op-eds, and they ended up keeping the statement, which is very good. I also heard discussions at Yale of trying to get the college council to release another statement that condemns anti-Semitism. So you can release this statement, for Palestine, but then you also have to clarify that you're against anti-Semitism, which I think is just a terrible thing to do. And of course, conflating Zionism, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, and just all the things that we've talked about in this talk. So I don't know all the schools, but I know it's a growing number. And I think that there's only progress, there's only more possibility. I think something like a BDS initiative at Yale is really possible. Something I don't think I mentioned in my talk was that there is a really vibrant, probably the largest organizing group at Yale is organizing for fossil fuel divestment. So I was actually part of a protest at the Harvard-Yale game like 2 or 3 years ago. We like sat on the field and interrupted the football game to call for fossil fuel divestment and Puerto Rican debt divestment for the Yale endowment, which is like ginormous. But that movement doesn't mention any holdings. And we really haven't called upon Yale as of yet to disclose any of its investments in Israel. And so I think that's something that's also on the horizon for us. So.
Just to clarify a couple of things, we're talking about student governments, various names passing resolutions. Some of them may be explicitly endorsing BDS. Most common is calling on the universities to divest from corporations, either from Israeli corporations or more frequently large corporations that are complicit in the occupation or apartheid in Israel, Palestine. I don't think there's a single university that has, where the university itself has endorsed, certainly not endorsed BDS or actually divested. So we're talking about student governments. And I think, and there are dozens that have passed such resolutions.
As I think,
excuse me, Steve, but it's 8:15, and we try to end at these webinars at 8:15. I don't know if there's one more question that you think it would be really. I mean, I'm sure all the questions are good, but is there one that just like strikes you?
There are no other questions in the Q&A.
Oh, okay, great. So thank you to the three speakers, Ryan, David, and Soni. This has been a really interesting evening, and we really appreciate your participating. And thanks to all of you who I can't see, who joined us tonight. So good night, everyone.